Hello everybody. Today we are going to discuss about photography basics. Ever wonder what it is that actually makes the camera work? This tutorial will cover the inner working of the camera and introduce you into photography basics and the expansive world of taking better photographs. To take beautiful photographs, you do not need an expensive camera and a bag full of equipments. What is important is the photographer's ability to see his or her surrounding and use knowledge and personal feel for the subject. Being the first article in this series, this lesson is meant to only cover the basics of photographs. I have taken this in a way like understanding the science behind photography, understanding the basic settings and parameters that affects the exposure of the image taken, and then finally understanding the modes in camera. The idea with this series is to get people more interested in photography, awaken creativity, and hopefully help people enjoy this hobby even more. The photography forum that I created at my workplace plays an important role in developing this free tutorial. I request each and every viewer to give your comments for my improvement, and I would love to hear your feedback and questions. Okay, now let us start with the session of explaining about photography. The word photography is French but is based on Greek word and literally means drawing with light. That's the reason in the beginning of this tutorial we mentioned that photography is an art with light. That's what photography is all about. Without light, no photograph. The art of photography is basically seeing and balancing the light. Let's get into the science of it. Components involved are lens, aperture, shutter, and a sensor. First, the light needs to go through the lens, which is a series of differently shaped pieces of glasses. If the focus is good, then the light will meet on the screen or the sensor. The aperture is placed inside the lens and is basically an opening that controls how much light reaches the sensor. On most modern cameras, the shutter is placed inside the camera body. This piece of mechanics is what controls how long time the sensor is exposed to the light. The sensor is a very sensitive plate where the light is absorbed and transformed into pixels. As you can see on this illustration, the image the sensor picks up is actually upside down, just like your eyes seeing the world. The processor inside the camera body then flips it. This is what happens in all the cameras. In special cameras or DSLR, the user have accessibility to vary different parameters to get the desired output. Out of those parameters, the three major or primary parameters are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let us discuss in detail about each of them. First, let us get hold of aperture. The aperture sits inside the lens and controls how much light passes through the lens and onto the sensor. A large aperture lets through very much light and vice versa. Knowing how much aperture affects the photograph is one of the most important part of photography. It affects the amount of light, depth of field, lens speed, sharpness, vignetting, among other things. I will talk about these things in later part of this series. Now let us discuss about f number. A f number is a mathematical number that expresses the diameter of the aperture, are an important part of understanding how the aperture and exposure work. All f numbers have the common notations such as f by 5.6 for an f number of 5.6. There are set numbers of f numbers that are used in photography. There are several different scales, but the standard full stop f number scale is this: f by 1.4, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22 and 32. These are known as full stop f number. If you decrease the f number with one full stop like f by 4 to f by 2.8, the amount of light that passes through will double. If you increase the f number with one full stop like f by 5.6 to f by 8, only half amount of light will reach the sensor. There can be several f numbers between 1 above, depending on what scale is being used. The most common one is the 1/3 scale, which means that every third step is one full step, and thus giving you two settings between every full stop. For example, between f by 8 and f by 11, you will get f by 9 and f by 10. This can be rather confusing at the first time, so here's the short reminder. The higher the number means the smaller the aperture and less the light. The lower the f number means the larger the aperture and more light. That is all about aperture. But before closing the chapter of aperture, I would like to quote the lines from the initial sentence stating, "Aperture sits inside the lens." From this, one must realize that the aperture is inbuilt in lens and the shutter speed is inbuilt in the camera body. That's the reason we get lens with aperture number marked in it and not the shutter speed. Next, we discuss about shutter speed. The shutter is what controls how long the sensor is exposed to the light. The longer the shutter is open, the more the light can be captured by the sensor. The fast shutter speed will result in freezing a moving object, and the slow shutter speed will let you capture the motion of a moving object. There is a scale of stops for the shutter speed, just like the aperture. Below are the full stops: 1 by 1000 seconds, 1 by 500, 1 by 250, 1 by 125, 1 by 60, 1 by 30, 1 by 15, 1 by 8, 1 by 4, 1 by 2 and 1. And just as with the aperture, the shutter speed is often on the 1/3 scale, giving you two steps in between every full stop. For example, between 1 by 60th of seconds and 1 by 125th of second, you will find 1 by 80 and 1 by 100. The two primary factors that control exposure are shutter speed and aperture. We will cover these things in greater detail in other lessons. Now, let us get into ISO settings. What is an ISO? The name comes from the International Organization for Standardization. This ISO speed is a measure of the film speed or its sensitivity to light. With digital cameras, the ISO affects the sensor instead of the film, but the principle is the same. A low ISO speed requires a longer exposure and is referred to as slow. A high ISO speed requires less time to give the same exposure and is therefore referred to as fast. One step in the ISO equals one full stop. So the ISO is not on the 1/3 scale. Film can be found with 1/3 ISO speed, but it is uncommon in digital world. These are the most common ISO speeds: ISO 50, ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400, ISO 800, ISO 1600, ISO 3200. On 35mm film, a film with high ISO speed had much more grain than the slower film, but the modern sensor don't create the same grain with high ISO speed. Instead, it creates noise. The digital noise is not as favorable as the film grain and can destroy the photo if it is too visible. If light is no problem, then always use low ISO number. But if you are indoor with bad light and other conditions, when you find the combination of aperture and shutter speed not to be enough, the ISO speed can be a great asset. New digital sensors are constantly developed and the noise level with a high ISO speed are decreased with every new release. By now we have completed understanding the three major parameters or variables like aperture, shutter speed and the ISO. These three parameters or variables affects mainly the exposure of any image taken. Now let us study about exposure. What do you mean by exposure? The exposure is a combination factor of how long time the sensor is exposed to light, how much light comes through and how sensitivity the sensor is to the light. Let us study in detail. For example, you take a photograph with the following setting, that is aperture is f/8, shutter speed is 1/250th of the second and the ISO is 100. But let's say you want to freeze the object more, which requires faster shutter speed. You can either change the ISO or the aperture. First of all, let's change the shutter speed by one stop faster, that is from 1/250th of second to 1/500th of the second. Now only half the amount of light will reach the sensor. To compensate this and keep the exposures the same, you can change the aperture size one stop larger, that is from f/8 to f/5.6. So with aperture f/5.6, shutter speed 1/500 and ISO 100 will give the same exposure as aperture f/8, shutter speed 1/250 and ISO 100. But now the shutter speed is faster, which allows you to freeze your object in a different way. Now let us take a different scenario. You are indoor with bad light condition, which makes your current setting too slow and are unable to hold the camera steady enough. The settings are f/5.6, 1/60th of the second and ISO 100. Your lens largest aperture be f/4, which is 1 f-stop larger than 5.6. Changing your shutter speed one stop faster will result in f/4, 1/125 and ISO 100. The shutter speed is still too slow and the result is blurry due to the camera shake. Hence we have to use 1/250th of the second. Since you cannot change the aperture anymore, you will have to change the ISO setting. One stop will result in ISO 200. You now have f/4, 1/250th of the second and ISO 200, which should be enough to get a sharp photograph. As you hopefully can see from these examples, all three parameters of the exposure are related to each other. If you just change one of them, the result will either be underexposed or an overexposed photograph. But if you change both, you can keep the balance. Now let us see about what is overexposed and underexposed images are. Overexposure happens when the sensor is exposed to more than enough light, resulting in white images, or at least white areas in the image around the light source. Sometimes it's impossible to expose a photograph correctly without getting some overexposed areas. Overexposed areas can be used as an effect, but most of the time it's unwanted and avoidable. Underexposure is the opposite of overexposure and is the result of the sensor not getting enough light. The photo is dark. Underexposure can be used artistically, but just like overexposure, it can be unwanted and avoidable. Now the question is whether to underexpose or to overexpose. With digital cameras, it's much easier to bring back the light and colors from underexposed areas than it is to bring back shades into overexposed areas. If you are photographing in RAW, you might want to consider to underexpose your images on purpose to avoid losing details in overexposed areas, and then use digital Lightroom to bring back the light from the underexposed area if needed. This depends on the light condition, and indoors it can be a good idea to overexpose instead. I personally always underexpose my outdoor photographs, 2/3 of f-stop, for this reason, and have found the result much more pleasing than the correct exposure. And another wonderful option is the exposure lock option. Exposure lock is a great feature that's available in most of the cameras. It's rather easy to understand what it does. It locks the exposure so that it doesn't recalculate the exposure if you move the camera around. Try to find the naturally exposed part of your subject. Not the light source, nor the shadow, but something in between. And press the exposure lock button. Recompose your photo and take the picture. As a result, you will get a naturally exposed images. When talking about camera settings, we must know the camera modes as a basic thing. There are several modes, but basically categorized into three main categories. First is the basic, second is the advanced, and third is the pro. Let us see what are the modes available in basic. First comes the sports. The purpose of this mode is to tell the camera to default its setting towards capturing images moving faster. This is done by using higher ISO and as well as the faster shutter speed. Increasing the ISO is nothing but increasing the film speed. Increasing the film speed helps to offset this light loss by increasing the sensitivity of film, making the camera need less light to record an image. Next is the increasing the shutter speed. Increasing the shutter speed helps to freeze the action, that is, stop moving objects in mid-motion. It also decreases the amount of light striking the film surface. Hence, this mode is called as sports mode. Next comes the landscape, which uses a small aperture to gain more depth of field. Next to it is macro, which uses large aperture to get a shorter background. Then it's the night portrait, uses long exposure to capture the entire scene, often combined with built-in flash. Then comes a portrait, which uses a large aperture to shorten the depth of field. Next is the auto setting, that is auto mode. In this, everything is in auto, including ISO, flash and image quality. These are the several settings or modes available with basic category. Now let us move on to advanced category, where we have only two settings, which is known as AV and TV. AV or A is aperture priority. You control the aperture and the camera calculates the shutter speed for the best exposure, where TV or S is shutter priority. You control the shutter speed and the camera calculates the aperture. The AV setting is very useful where the photographer knows that he wants either a large or small depth of field, but the shutter speed is not important. Whereas the TV mode settings is very useful in action settings and for night photography when the shutter speed needs to be accurately controlled. Next is the P or program mode, a more advanced form of auto mode. The camera calculates the aperture and shutter speed but doesn't affect any settings like ISO or flash. These are all the modes available with advanced category. Now let us move on to Pro category. In Pro category, there is only one mode known as manual mode. Manual mode returns controls of all the camera functions to the photographer. It gives control, that is full control over both aperture and shutter speed. I always recommend the amateur photographers to use this manual mode to learn photography. Thus, we have come to an end of this session, Basics of Photography. Thank you for listening.